Chapter 1. Remember. The forest was dark and quiet. Mira stood alone, staring up at the big, round moon. It felt like the moon was watching her, glowing brighter than ever before. The trees around her swayed gently, but something didn't feel right. Her heart started beating faster. She didn't know why, but she felt like she needed to run. Mira took a step forward, but suddenly, the ground under her feet felt strange. She looked down and gasped. There was blood. It was everywhere, and it was hers. Mira's knees wobbled, and she dropped to the ground. Her hands shook as she tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't move. She felt cold all over, even though she could hear her heart pounding loudly in her ears. Then she saw them. Zayn and Sylvia stood a few feet away, watching her. Zayn and Sylvia stood a few feet away, watching. He wasn't smiling. He looked serious, almost like he didn't care. Sylvia stood next to him, holding onto his arm like she belonged there. She was smiling, just a little, but it wasn't a kind smile. Mira opened her mouth to ask what was happening, but no words came out. She didn't understand. Zayn was her mate. Sylvia was her best friend. Why were they standing there doing nothing? Zayn stepped closer, kneeling down beside her. His hand brushed against her cheek, but it didn't feel the same. His touch was cold. "This is how it ends, Mira," he said softly. Sylvia knelt next to him, grinning. "Oh, you should have known," she whispered. Mira tried to grab Zayn's hand, but he pulled away. The sound of a wolf howling echoed through the forest. It sounded far away, but somehow she felt like it was meant for her. Before she could do anything, Zayn and Sylvia turned and walked into the shadows, leaving her behind. The forest grew darker, and Mira's eyes felt heavy. The moon above her seemed to shine even brighter as everything faded away. Mira shot up in bed, gasping for air. Her heart was racing, and her hands felt clammy. She looked down. No blood, no forest, just her blankets and the soft glow of the moonlight coming through her window. She sat there for a long moment, breathing hard. It was just a dream, right? But even as she lay back down, Mira couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The pack house felt quieter than usual. Too quiet. Mira leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the clock on the wall. 10:17 a.m. She sighed and glanced at the empty coffee mug in her hand. The lockdown had blurred time, making every day feel the same. Even the air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in. Behind her, the soft hum of the TV drifted in from the living room. Sylvia's laugh followed. It wasn't loud, but Mira heard it clear as day. She tried not to listen, but the sound stuck to her like glue. Mira shook it off and rinsed her mug. "It's just lockdown," she told herself. "Everyone's acting weird." When she turned around, Zayn was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. His black t-shirt stretched over his broad shoulders, and his hair was still damp from his morning shower. He hadn't said much to her today. Hadn't said much at all lately. Sylvia sat cross-legged at the other end of the couch, leaning in just slightly. She tucked her short blonde hair behind her ear and smiled as Zayn said something under his breath. Mira couldn't hear what he said, but Sylvia's eyes lit up like he'd told the funniest joke ever. Mira grabbed a cloth and started wiping the counters, even though they were already clean. She tried to sound light-hearted, but the words felt forced. Sylvia grinned. "That's because you're not binge-watching shows with us. Come, sit." Mira hesitated, but she joined them, sinking into the armchair across from the couch. She tucked her legs under her, watching the two of them interact. It wasn't wrong, but something about it made her wolf stir uneasily beneath her skin. "You two seem to be having fun," Mira said, keeping her tone casual. Sylvia smiled at her. "We were just talking about the old training days. Remember when Zayn used to wipe the floor with everyone?" Mira laughed softly. "Yeah, you barely made it through training." "I survived, didn't I?" Sylvia grinned wider, nudging Zayn's shoulder playfully. Mira's eyes flicked to Zayn. His smile didn't reach his eyes, but he didn't pull away from Sylvia's touch. Mira told herself it was nothing. Sylvia was her best friend. Zayn was her mate. There was no reason to feel this. Weird. But as Sylvia laughed again, Mira caught it. A glance. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Zayn's eyes lingered on Sylvia for a second too long. Mira blinked, brushing her hair behind her ear. "It's nothing," she told herself again. "I'm just tired." Still, as the day stretched on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting beneath the surface. Chapter 2: Shadows in the Hall. But then she caught a second voice, soft and familiar. Sylvia. Mira frowned. It wasn't weird for Sylvia to talk to Zayn. They worked together on pack issues all the time. But something about the way they were speaking now felt different, quieter, secretive. She took a step closer. The door was cracked just enough to let the sound slip through. It was narrow, very quiet, metallic. Sylvia whispered. Zayn's voice deep. Mira couldn't catch what he said, but whatever it was made Sylvia laugh softly. Mira's wolf shifted restlessly beneath her skin. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the doorframe. "Don't be stupid," she told herself. "It's probably nothing." Still, the longer she stood there, the heavier her chest felt. She turned to leave, but as she stepped away, the sound of movement stopped her. The faint rustle of fabric. Footsteps. Then a soft growl. Mira's heart skipped. She took another step forward and pushed the door open. Zayn stood near his desk, shirt half unbuttoned. Sylvia was inches from him, hair tousled, cheeks flushed. She looked over her shoulder, startled, eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. Mira froze, her hand gripping the door tighter. "What?" Mira's voice came out weaker than she wanted. She cleared her throat and forced herself to stand taller. "What's going on?" Sylvia stepped back, fixing her hair quickly. "Nothing." Her tone was breezy, but the nervous flicker in her eyes said otherwise. "We were just talking about patrol shifts." Zayn met Mira's gaze, his expression cool. "It's not what it looks like." Mira's wolf stirred, growling low in her chest. "I didn't say it looked like anything." Zayn shrugged, casually buttoning his shirt like nothing had happened. "We got too close. It's not a big deal." Too close. Mira's nails dug into her palm. Her wolf wanted to press, to growl, to question the way Sylvia's scent clung to him like perfume. But Zayn's calm stare made her hesitate. "Seriously, Mira?" Sylvia added, flashing a quick smile. "You know I'd never—" Mira forced herself to breathe. This was Sylvia, her best friend. Zayn's beta. She was overthinking it. "Right," Mira muttered, stepping back. "I'll, let you two finish." Zayn nodded, already distracted by the papers on his desk. Sylvia gave Mira a small wave, but the air between them felt heavier than before. Mira walked down the hall, Zayn's hoodie forgotten. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was imagining things, but as she crossed the threshold to her room, the faint scent of Sylvia still lingered in the air, and Mira couldn't quite convince herself that everything was fine. The pack house was buzzing with low voices. Everyone had gathered in the common room for one of Zayn's important updates, but no one knew why. Mira leaned against the wall near the back, arms crossed, eyes flicking between Zayn and Sylvia at the front of the room. Zayn's gaze swept over the pack, his expression calm but firm. His alpha presence filled the space easily, demanding attention without effort. Sylvia stood just to his right, a little closer than necessary. She wasn't smiling, but the glint in her eyes made Mira's wolf shift uneasily. "We've been adjusting to the lockdown for weeks now," Zayn began, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. "But it's clear we need to tighten things up. The city's quiet, but rogues aren't. We need stronger leadership, more focus," Mira said. Mira's brows furrowed slightly. Stronger leadership? What did that mean? Zayn continued, clasping his hands behind his back. "From today on, Sylvia will step into a new advisory role. She'll oversee patrol schedules, resource distribution, and manage internal pack affairs." Mira blinked. The room stayed silent for a moment before a few pack members nodded in quiet approval. Mira forced herself to stay still, even as her stomach twisted. That was her role, or at least, it used to be. As Luna, Mira had always been by Zayn's side for decisions like these. Now he was handing those responsibilities to Sylvia without so much as a discussion. Her fingers dug into her arm, but she kept her expression neutral. Zayn glanced in her direction briefly, but there was no apology in his eyes, just business. It wasn't unusual for the Alpha's beta to handle things during stressful times, but Sylvia's sudden rise felt off. Too fast, too personal. Mira had been by Zayn's side for years. They'd built the pack together, and now it felt like she was being slowly pushed aside, piece by piece. Sylvia caught Mira staring and offered a small, knowing smile. It wasn't friendly. Mira's wolf growled softly in the back of her mind. Mira wasn't sure what she'd missed, but she knew one thing. Sylvia was too comfortable, and Zayn wasn't stopping her. Chapter 3. Mira shifted, watching him closely. It had been days since they'd spent any real time together. Every time she tried, something seemed to pull him away. Not tonight. Mira stood and crossed the room, settling onto the arm of his chair. She leaned in, brushing her fingers over his shoulder. "Hey," she said softly. "We should stay up tonight, just us." Zayn glanced at her, but didn't put his phone down. "I'm tired, Mira. Maybe another night." Releasing her hand, he pulled back and turned around. "Let's try by another location for a visit then," she said. "I could use a stress." Zayn sighed, finally lowering his phone. "No pack duties, no stress." Zayn sighed, finally lowering his phone. His dark eyes met hers, but they held none of the warmth she was used to. "Work. I need some air," he muttered. "I'll go for a run." Mira's hand slipped from his shoulder. A run? That was his excuse for everything lately. Before she could respond, footsteps creaked behind them. Mira turned to see Sylvia leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching them. "Is now a bad time?" Sylvia asked, though she didn't seem too concerned about interrupting. Mira clenched her jaw. "Yes, it is." Sylvia smirked, but didn't move. Zayn stood, already heading for the door. "It's fine. I'll see you later." Mira frowned. "Zayn!" The door clicked shut behind him, and Mira was left standing there, her heart sinking lower with every passing second. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of Zayn walking across the compound. He wasn't heading toward the woods. He was going straight toward Sylvia's room. Mira's chest tightened, but she said nothing. It's just a coincidence, she told herself. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The pack house was dark, and the moon hung low outside Mira's window. The clock on her nightstand read 2:14 a.m., but sleep felt impossible. Mira lay on her side, staring at the empty space beside her. Zayn's pillow was untouched. Cold. She told herself it was fine. Zayn was just clearing his head like he always said. Maybe he was patrolling the border or shifting to burn off stress. But the hollow ache in her chest said otherwise. Mira sat up, tossing the blanket aside as quietly as she could. The floor creaked under her bare feet as she made her way to the window. The night air was still, and most of the pack house was quiet, except for the faint sound of footsteps outside. Her eyes narrowed. Zayn. He crossed the courtyard, moving slowly as if he didn't want to draw attention. Mira's gaze followed him, until he passed beneath a lamppost, and the soft glow revealed more than she wanted to see. His shirt was rumpled, hair slightly messy, like he hadn't bothered fixing it. But what struck her most was the faint scent trailing behind him. Sylvia. Mira's wolf stirred instantly, ears perking in the back of her mind. She stepped away from the window, heart thudding. You don't know for sure, she thought. Maybe they just talked. Still, doubt crept in like fog, curling around her heart. The door to Sylvia's room down the hall creaked softly, and Mira knew she wasn't imagining things. Zayn slipped inside their shared bedroom a few minutes later, not saying a word. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't even look at her. Mira watched him quietly, clenching the edge of the blanket in her hands. Her wolf bristled. A low growl vibrated through Mira's chest, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something else. A warning. Something had shifted. Zayn lay down beside her, as if nothing had happened, his back turned away. Mira stared at the ceiling, heart aching as her wolf's growl faded into silence. But the bond between them felt thinner, like a thread stretched too far, ready to snap. Chapter 4. The pack house hummed with soft conversation and laughter. It was supposed to be a simple gathering, something to lift everyone's spirits during lockdown. Mira stood near the edge of the room, holding a drink she barely touched. Zayn was nowhere to be seen. She scanned the crowd, catching glimpses of familiar faces, but not his. Or Sylvia's. Her wolf stirred uneasily beneath the surface. Relax, Mira told herself. They're probably handling something for the pack. Still, her eyes drifted toward the hallway leading to the private wing. She hesitated for a moment before setting down her glass and slipping out of the room. The farther she walked, the quieter it got. Mira's footsteps slowed as she neared Zayn's office. The door was cracked open, faint voices drifting out. Her pulse quickened. She pushed the door open just enough to see inside, and froze. Zayn's back was against the wall, Sylvia pressed against him. His hands gripped her waist, and their lips met in a way that left no room for doubt. Mira's heart slammed into her ribs. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Sylvia noticed her first. She pulled away just slightly, brushing her hair behind her ear like nothing had happened. "Oh," Sylvia said casually, as if she'd just been caught having coffee with him. "Mira." Zayn turned, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. Mira stepped into the room, her nails biting into her palms. "What the hell is this?" Zayn ran a hand through his hair, sighing like she'd interrupted something important. "It's not what it looks like." Mira stared at him, waiting for an explanation, but he didn't offer one. "Not what it looks like." Mira's voice trembled, but not with fear. I just saw you. Sylvia stepped back, crossing her arms. You're overreacting. We were talking, and it got a little too close, that's all. Mira's wolf growled low inside her, but Zayn cut her off before she could speak. She's right. His voice was calm, almost bored. We're under a lot of stress. Emotions are high. It was a mistake, Mira. You're making this bigger than it is. Mira's fists tightened. I saw you, Zayn. Don't stand there and act like I'm imagining things. He stepped toward her, his eyes locking onto hers with that same cool, distant gaze. Look, I get it, Zayn said, voice lowering. You've been feeling off lately. Maybe you're reading into things that aren't really there. Mira's breath caught in her throat. Is he serious? You're paranoid, Zayn added, his hand brushing against her arm. Sylvia's your friend. She wouldn't do that to you. I wouldn't do that to you. Mira stared at him, the words sinking in slowly. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't even denying it. He was shifting the blame, making it seem like she was the problem. Her wolf snarled beneath the surface, but Mira forced herself to stay calm. She stepped back, shaking her head. Fine. Her voice was quiet but firm. If that's the story you're sticking with, I'll let it go. Zayn's shoulders relaxed slightly, like he thought he'd won. But as Mira left the office and walked back toward the pack gathering, she felt the last fragile thread of their bond snap. She didn't believe him, and now she wasn't sure she ever would again. Mira sat at the long dining table, watching the empty chair beside her. Zayn's spot. The rest of the pack gathered around, chatting quietly as they waited for the weekly meeting to start. But Zayn wasn't here. Again. Her eyes drifted to the head of the table where he usually sat. Only now Sylvia was there, leaning over to talk to the beta. She laughed softly at something he said, tucking a piece of hair behind her ear. Mira's stomach twisted. For the past 2 weeks, Sylvia had been everywhere Zayn was. Patrols, meetings, even private alpha discussions Mira used to be part of. Now, she found out about pack decisions after they were already made. She tried to ignore it at first, but the more it happened, the harder it was to pretend nothing was wrong. Mira. She blinked and looked up. One of the elders was watching her carefully. Is Alpha Zayn joining us? He asked. Mira forced a smile. I'm sure he'll be here soon. The elder nodded politely and went back to talking with the others, but Mira barely heard a word. Her wolf stirred uneasily beneath the surface. As the meeting started, Zayn finally appeared, sliding into his seat at the head of the table. Mira let out a quiet breath, but before she could speak to him, Sylvia slipped in right behind him. She stood at his side, hands resting lightly on the back of his chair, like she belonged there. Zayn didn't seem to mind. Mira frowned. That's not her place. But she stayed quiet. The meeting dragged on, with Zayn discussing patrol shifts and border security. Mira sat still, but her focus wasn't on the meeting. It was on the way Zayn leaned in when Sylvia whispered something to him, how he nodded without asking for anyone else's opinion. She used to sit beside him, sharing ideas and decisions. Now Sylvia filled that space. Mira's wolf bristled. When the meeting ended, pack members filtered out of the room one by one. Mira lingered, waiting for a chance to speak with Zayn alone. No. But before she could approach, Sylvia grabbed his arm and pulled him aside, leading him down the hall. Mira clenched her jaw, gripping the edge of the table as the door shut behind them. Her wolf's voice was clear this time. If you don't do something now, it's going to get worse. Mira took a slow breath, trying to push the warning aside. But deep down, she knew her wolf was right. Chapter 5. A New Face. Mira sat stiffly in front of the laptop, her fingers tapping against the side of her mug. The screen glowed brightly in the dim office, showing a grid of video feeds, as pack leaders joined the online council meeting. Zayn sat next to her, scrolling through his phone as he waited for everyone to log in. Across the table, Sylvia leaned forward, like she belonged there. Mira glanced at her but said nothing. She was supposed to be by Zayn's side during these meetings. Sylvia wasn't. "Everyone here?" Zayn's voice cut through the quiet, eyes flicking to the screen. A few pack alphas grumbled responses. Mira recognized most of them, but one face stood out. A man in his late 20s, with dark eyes and an easy smirk. His hair was supposed to be by Zayn's side during these meetings. Sylvia wasn't neither. She gripped Zayn's hand as he led her into the shell. That had to be Adrian, alpha of the Night Fang pack. Mira had heard about him, but never spoken to him directly. His pack wasn't known for playing nice with others, but they kept to their borders and didn't cause trouble. Until now. "Adrian?" Zayn greeted coolly. "Didn't expect to see you here." Adrian's smirk didn't waver. "Figured I'd check in, you know how it is." Sylvia shifted slightly in her seat, eyes narrowing at Adrian's casual tone. "As long as your pack's handling things on your end, we won't have any problems," Zayn added, leaning back. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I was about to say the same to you." Mira's gaze snapped to Adrian, surprised by the sharpness in his voice. The other alphas stayed quiet, watching the exchange carefully. "What's that supposed to mean?" Zayn's tone darkened. Adrian shrugged. "Only that we've heard things. Your pack seems distracted lately." His eyes flicked briefly to Mira, lingering for a second too long. "Wonder why that is?" Mira's heart skipped, but she didn't look away. Sylvia's hand brushed Zayn's arm under the table, subtle but obvious to Mira. She fought the urge to pull it away. "This is a waste of time," Zayn muttered. "Let's move on." The rest of the meeting dragged on with discussions about patrols and rogue sightings, but Mira couldn't focus. She felt Adrian's gaze on her more than once, but he never said anything directly to her. When the meeting ended, the video feeds disappeared one by one until only Adrian's was left. His smirk softened as his screen blinked off. Mira let out a slow breath and closed the laptop. Zayn stood, stretching his arms. "I need to check on something. Can you handle things here?" he asked, looking at Sylvia. "Not Mira." Sylvia smiled. "Of course." Mira didn't respond. She just nodded as Zayn left the room, Sylvia following closely behind. The moment the door clicked shut, Mira's phone buzzed. She glanced down. A message from an unknown number. "If you ever want the truth about your alpha, let me know. I, Adrian." Mira's wolf stirred uneasily. She stared at the message for a long moment before locking her phone and setting it aside. Maybe it was nothing, but part of her wasn't so sure. Mira stared at her phone, Adrian's message still glowing on the screen. "If you ever want the truth about your alpha, let me know." Her thumb hovered over the reply button. She didn't need this. She didn't need Adrian's opinions or cryptic warnings. Whatever was happening between her and Zayn, she could handle it. This was her mate, her pack. Mira stared at her phone and pressed delete. Gone. Just like that. She tossed the phone onto the bed and sat down, running her hands through her hair. The room felt heavier than usual, like the air wasn't moving. Zayn's side of the bed was still perfectly made. He hadn't slept there last night. But tonight would be different. Mira grabbed her planner from the nightstand and flipped it open. She circled the evening, jotting down date night, just us. She was done waiting for things to fix themselves. Later that day, Mira worked quietly in the kitchen, pulling together ingredients for Zayn's favorite meal: steak, garlic potatoes, and roasted vegetables. The smell filled the air, and for the first time in days, Mira felt like things might go back to normal. She had set the table, lit a few candles, and even put on the deep red sweater Zayn always said he liked. The soft hum of music played from the speaker as she glanced at the clock. 6:45 p.m. Zayn should be home soon. Mira's wolf stirred with anticipation, tail wagging faintly in the back of her mind. Tonight would be a reset. Something they desperately needed. But by 7:30, Zayn still wasn't home. Mira stared at her phone, checking for messages. Nothing. She bit her lip and texted him. "Mira, dinner's ready. Where are you?" She waited, staring at the screen, willing the typing bubble to appear. 10 minutes passed, then 15. At 8:15, her phone buzzed. "Zayn kagivorum vayanalsi." "Can't make it tonight. Something came up." Mira's heart sank. She set the phone down on the counter, swallowing the disappointment that lodged itself in her throat. Her wolf's ears flattened, tail drooping. Mira forced herself to take a breath. It's fine. He's busy. The pack comes first. She blew out the candles and put the food away, but the house felt colder now, like all the warmth had seeped out the second his message arrived. Later that night, Mira walked down the hall, passing Zayn's office. His scent lingered faintly in the air, but it wasn't fresh. As she neared the living room, soft laughter caught her attention. Mira paused. She peeked around the corner, and her stomach dropped. Sylvia stood by the fireplace, wrapped in Zayn's jacket. She didn't see Mira right away. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Mira's wolf bristled instantly, eyes narrowing. "Sylvia," Mira said, stepping into the room. Sylvia looked up, startled for just a second, before her usual calm expression returned. "Oh, hey," she said casually, tugging the jacket tighter. Mira's eyes lingered on the jacket. "That's Zayn's," Mira said flatly. Sylvia's smile didn't waver. "Yeah, he let me borrow it. After training." Almost immediately, across the cafe, it was cold outside. Mira clenched her fists. She wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she turned and walked away, her wolf growling softly beneath the surface. "It's fine," she told herself. "It's just a jacket." But deep down, she knew it wasn't just that. The pack house was quieter than usual. Too quiet. Mira walked slowly down the hallway, the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet the only sound. Something felt off. Zayn had been distant for weeks, but tonight, the tension felt different. Heavier. Her wolf stirred uneasily. As Mira approached Zayn's office, she heard faint voices. The door was almost closed, but not completely. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but something pulled her forward. "I'm just saying," Sylvia's voice drifted through the crack. "She's not fit to lead. The pack knows it." Mira froze. "She's Luna." Zayn replied softly, "For now, but that bond's hanging by a thread, and we both know it. The pack needs a Luna who actually does something, not one stuck in the past." Mira's heart pounded. Her grip on the door tightened as she leaned closer. Facing the door, Mira leaned closer to whisper the words into her mind. "Biti. We can't rush this," Zayn said, but there was no fire in his voice. No defense. Sylvia's voice softened, almost a whisper. "You know it's better this way. The pack already looks to me. When it breaks, they'll understand. And so will she." Mira's breath caught in her throat. When it breaks? Her chest tightened. For a second she considered barging in, demanding answers, but her legs got nowhere. Zayn's silence spoke louder than anything else. Mira took a step back, carefully retreating down the hall. She felt like she couldn't breathe, like the walls were pressing in around her. Her hand brushed the stair railing as she made her way toward the front door. The cool air outside would help. She just needed to think. But before she could step outside, a voice stopped her. "Going somewhere?" Mira turned sharply to see Sylvia standing at the top of the stairs, leaning casually against the railing. Mira straightened, masking the storm swirling inside her. "Just needed some air." Sylvia's gaze lingered on her, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. She took a slow step down. "You heard us." It wasn't a question. Mira clenched her jaw. "You're out of line." Sylvia tilted her head slightly, like she was sizing Mira up. "You don't get it, do you?" she said softly. "The pack's already chosen sides. You're holding on to something that's already slipping away." Mira's wolf growled low in the back of her mind, but Mira held it down. "You think Zayn will let this happen?" Mira asked, narrowing her eyes. Sylvia's lips curved into a small, smug smile. "I don't think, Mira. I know." The words struck like a knife. Sylvia brushed past her, heading toward the kitchen like nothing had happened. "You're not as untouchable as you think." Mira stayed rooted to the spot, heart hammering in her chest. Her hands trembled at her sides. She's wrong, Mira told herself. She wouldn't let this happen, but the lingering doubt in her heart whispered otherwise. Chapter 6. Silent War. Mira sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint line of moonlight that stretched across the floor. Her heart still hadn't settled since the conversation she overheard. When it breaks. The words looped in her head, over and over. Mira clenched her fists. She was waiting for the bond between them to snap. Mira clenched her fists. She wasn't going to let that happen. Her wolf growled softly in the back of her mind, ready to fight. If they want to play this game, I'll play it better. Mira slipped out of the room quietly, making her way down the hall toward Zayn's office. The house was dark and silent, the rest of the pack asleep. Even Sylvia's usual lingering presence was missing. She eased the office door open. It creaked softly, but no one stirred. Mira moved quickly, opening drawers and flipping through paperwork. Resource lists? Nothing unusual. She glanced at the computer screen, but it was locked. Her eyes shifted to the bookshelves, scanning for anything that looked out of place. Under Total Exhausted with 2 kids to run, she grabbed a bunch of favorite books, only to find them completely missing. Her fingers brushed against a thin leather notebook tucked behind a row of ledgers. She pulled it out, flipping through the pages. Sylvia's handwriting. Mira's stomach tightened. Detailed schedules, pack shifts, notes on border patrols. Things Mira should have been involved in. She recognized pack members' names, but what caught her attention was the list under future leadership positions. Sylvia's name was at the top. Mira's wasn't listed at all. Her grip on the notebook tightened, but she shoved it back where she found it. She needed more. This wasn't enough to confront Zayn. Not yet. As Mira shut the office door behind her, her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She pulled it out, expecting a message from Zayn, or hoping for one. Instead, it was Adrian. Adrian. Couldn't sleep? Mira frowned, glancing around as if he could somehow see her. Mira, what makes you say that? The typing bubble appeared almost immediately. I know that look. You're up to something. Mira hesitated before typing back. Mira? What if I am? This time, Adrian took longer to respond. Adrian? Then maybe I can help. Barefoot, Karen climbed the stairs, her feet bickering as she walked. Mira stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. Adrian was dangerous. He was a rival alpha, and getting too close to him could make things worse. But right now, she needed an ally, and Adrian seemed more than willing. Mira, meet me tomorrow. We need to talk. She tucked her phone away, ignoring the flutter in her chest. Whatever was happening between Zayn and Sylvia, Mira wouldn't sit by and let it unfold. She was ready to fight back. Mira paced the length of her room, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The walls felt smaller tonight, like they were closing in. Losing her Luna status wasn't just about pride, it was survival. If Zayn broke the bond, she wouldn't just lose her title, she'd lose everything. Her place, her home, her pack. Mira's wolf shifted restlessly, as if sensing the danger. She couldn't let it happen, not without a fight. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Mira crossed the room, opening it just enough to see Ava and Lucas, two of the packmates she trusted most. Come in, she whispered, glancing down the hallway to make sure no one was watching. Allie slowly entered. Ava slipped in first, her long dark hair tied back in a loose braid. Lucas followed, shutting the door quietly behind him. His sharp green eyes flicked to Mira, already sensing something was wrong. You said it was important, Ava said, sitting on the edge of the bed. What's going on? Mira hesitated, pressing her back against the door, as if to block out the rest of the world. It's Zayn, she admitted, keeping her voice low, contributing over towards the reception area, taking her at her words. And Sylvia, Lucas sighed. You're not the only one. Some of the others have noticed too. They don't say anything, because it's Zay. Mira nodded. I've seen the way she follows him around, Lucas said. Like she's already Luna. Ava's face darkened. You're not the only one. Some of the others have noticed too. They don't say anything, because it's Zay, but there are rumors. Mira's chest tightened. She knew it wasn't just in her head. Why didn't anyone tell me? She asked quietly. Ava met her gaze. Because we weren't sure you'd believe us. Mira looked away, sinking onto the edge of the bed next to Ava. If they succeed, she said, swallowing the lump in her throat, I lose everything. My title, my place in the pack. I don't even know if I'd be allowed to stay. Lucas sat against the wall, arms crossed. Zayn wouldn't kick you out. Wouldn't he? Mira shot back, unable to stop the bitterness creeping into her voice. He's barely looked at me these past few weeks. It's like I'm already gone. The room fell silent. Ava rested her hand on Mira's shoulder. You're not gone. Not yet. Mira looked at her, the words sinking in like an anchor. You have allies, Ava continued. Some of us still see you as Luna, no matter what Zayn does. Lucas nodded. But you have to be careful. If Sylvia senses you're onto her, she'll move faster. Mira exhaled slowly. One wrong move, and she could lose more than just her status. A knock at the door startled them. Mira's wolf bristled. Lucas opened it slightly, but the hallway was empty. No one was there. A small, folded piece of paper sat on the floor. Lucas bent down, picking it up and handing it to Mira. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the note. The handwriting was sharp and unfamiliar. Lucas remarked, "They aren't the only ones after your place." Mira's heart pounded. She exchanged glances with Ava and Lucas, their expressions hardening. "Who left this?" Ava whispered. Mira didn't know. But one thing was certain. Sylvia wasn't the only threat she had to face. Chapter 7. Unleashed. The moon hung low in the sky as Mira slipped through the trees, her steps light against the forest floor. The packhouse lights faded behind her, leaving only shadows and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Adrian was waiting. Mira didn't know why she agreed to meet him. Maybe it was curiosity. Or desperation. Either way, she wasn't turning back now. A figure leaned against an old oak tree near the clearing. Arms crossed, eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Adrian pushed off the tree as she approached, that signature smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Was wondering if you'd show," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I'm here," Mira replied, stopping a few feet away. She kept her posture firm, refusing to let him see the unease curling in her chest. Adrian's gaze flickered over her, like he was studying every inch. "You're tense," he noted. Mira crossed her arms. "Can you blame me?" Adrian chuckled softly. "Fair enough." Silence settled between them for a moment. Mira shifted under his stare, unsure of what to say. "I didn't come here to chat," she said, finally breaking the quiet. "You said you could help me." Adrian's smirk faded slightly, his expression turning more serious. "I can," he said, stepping closer. "But it's not just about fighting, Mira. It's about control." Mira frowned. "I have control." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Mira opened her mouth to argue, but Adrian was already circling her, his eyes sharp and knowing. "You've felt it, haven't you?" he continued. "You're wolf, stronger than before, more restless. But you keep pushing it down." Mira swallowed, her wolf stirring uneasily inside her. "You're holding back," Adrian said, stopping directly in front of her. "That's why Zayn's pulling away." Mira's breath caught in her throat. She hated how close to the truth he was. "I'm not holding back," she snapped. But even as she said it, doubt crept in. Adrian stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as if he could see straight through her. "Yes, you are. You've been Luna too long to not feel the shift. Your alpha side is waking up, Mira, and if you don't let it, it'll tear you apart." Mira stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "Show me," she said quietly. Adrian didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist, guiding her toward the clearing. "Close your eyes," he instructed. "Listen to your wolf. Don't fight it." Mira inhaled deeply, the cool night air filling her lungs. She let her eyes drift shut, focusing on the quiet hum beneath her skin. The energy that had been building for weeks. Adrian's voice was soft but firm. "Let it out." Mira exhaled, and something shifted. Her heart raced as warmth spread through her body, her wolf pushing closer to the surface. When she opened her eyes, Adrian was watching her carefully. "Better," he said, stepping back. "But you're still holding on." Mira's pulse quickened. She took a step toward him, her wolf buzzing with energy. Adrian's eyes darkened slightly, and Mira noticed it, the way his wolf reacted to her presence, his stance tightening just enough for her to catch it. The air between them thickened, electric and heavy. Adrian's wolf wasn't just reacting, it was responding. To her. Mira's breath slowed, and Adrian's gaze flickered to her lips, then back to her eyes. "You're stronger than you think, Mira," he murmured. Mira could feel it too. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid of the power growing inside her, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if Zayn was the only alpha she wanted. Mira smiled across the dining table, keeping her posture relaxed as Sylvia laughed at something Zayn said. She stirred her tea slowly, pretending not to notice the way Sylvia's hand lingered on Zayn's arm. It didn't bother her, not anymore, because Mira wasn't playing their game. She was playing her own. "Long day?" Zayn asked, glancing at Mira as if he suddenly remembered she was sitting there. Mira looked up, her smile soft but unreadable. "Yeah, but I'm managing." Sylvia smirked. "I'm sure." Mira ignored her, sipping from her cup like she hadn't just spent the night before training with Adrian. Her body still buzzed with the energy he hadn't even known she was capable of. It felt good, better than pretending to be fragile. Zayn's gaze lingered on Mira for a second longer than usual. His wolf stirred beneath the surface. She could sense it now, clearer than before. He was watching her. Good. The more suspicious he became, the closer he'd look, and the less he'd notice what was happening right under his nose. "Pack patrols are shifting," Zayn said, directing the conversation toward Sylvia. "I need you to lead tomorrow." Mira's hand tightened around her cup, but she said nothing. Sylvia nodded eagerly, sitting up straighter. "Of course, I can handle it." Mira forced a pleasant smile. Let her. The more power Zayn gave Sylvia, the easier it would be to prove what Mira already knew, that Sylvia wanted more than just a title. When dinner wrapped up, Zayn disappeared to his office, leaving Mira and Sylvia in the kitchen. Sylvia leaned against the counter, watching Mira carefully. "You seem calm," Sylvia said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Considering everything." Mira shrugged. "Wouldn't I be?" Sylvia tilted her head. "No reason." But the flicker of doubt in her expression was enough. Later that night, Mira slipped out of the pack house under the cover of darkness. She followed the narrow path that led deep into the woods, where Adrian waited near the edge of the territory line. "You're late," he said casually, his arms crossed as he leaned against a tree. Mira smiled. "I had to play my part." Adrian's eyes flickered with amusement. "How's that working out for you?" Mira stepped closer, standing just a few feet away. "So far, so good, huh?" Adrian watched her carefully, his wolf pacing beneath the surface. She could feel it again, the quiet pull between them, the way his presence seemed to calm the storm inside her. "Zayn's watching you," Adrian warned, his voice dropping slightly. "Let him." Adrian's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. As Mira headed back to the pack house, her wolf brushed against his, just for a second. The connection between them grew stronger each time they met. But she didn't stop it. Not yet. When she returned home, Zayn was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice sharp. Mira met his gaze calmly, shrugging off her jacket. "Just went for a run." His wolf stirred again, protective, possessive. Mira smiled to herself. Let him wonder. Chapter 8. On the Edge. The training field was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the faint thud of boots against the dirt. Mira stood with the rest of the pack, stretching her arms as the early morning sun crept over the treetops. Sylvia, of course, was front and center. She flashed a smile at Zayn as he gave instructions, standing a little too close like she belonged there. Mira bit down on the irritation bubbling in her chest. Focus, she told herself. You can handle this. Pair up, Zayn called out. We're running defensive drills today. Mira stepped forward, locking eyes with Sylvia. Want to spar, Luna? Sylvia asked sweetly, tilting her head. The way she said Luna felt like a jab. Mira's wolf shifted restlessly beneath the surface. Sure, Mira replied, keeping her voice calm. Let's see what you've got. The pack circled around as Mira and Sylvia squared off. Zayn watched from the edge, arms crossed, his gaze unreadable. Mira exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders. Sylvia struck first, lunging toward her. Mira dodged easily, stepping aside and countering with a swift kick to Sylvia's leg. Sylvia stumbled but caught herself quickly, flashing Mira a grin. Not bad, Sylvia taunted, circling her. But you're holding back. Mira's nails dug into her palms. She wasn't in the mood for games. Sylvia attacked again, this time aiming low, trying to sweep Mira's legs. Mira sidestepped, but Sylvia was fast, faster than she remembered. Their wolves brushed against each other beneath the surface, tense and ready to break free. Mira growled softly, muscles tensing. Sylvia smirked. What's the matter? Losing your touch? That did it. Mira's wolf surged forward. She lashed out, claws barely restrained, and slammed Sylvia hard against the ground. The force knocked the breath from Sylvia's lungs. The pack fell silent. Mira stood over Sylvia, her breathing heavy, claws half extended. Her wolf hovered just beneath the surface, snarling softly. Sylvia looked up at her, wide-eyed but smiling faintly. I need not hesitate, Sylvia sighed. Christ in heaven. Mira? Zayn's voice cut through the silence. Mira froze, blinking as the haze lifted. She stepped back quickly, curling her hands into fists to keep the claws from showing. Sylvia sat up, brushing dirt from her clothes. Guess I hit a nerve, she said lightly. Mira's wolf growled again, but this time she forced it down. Zayn approached, his eyes locked on Mira. Stay after, he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear. Mira's stomach twisted, but she nodded. The pack dispersed once training ended, but Mira stayed behind, wiping sweat from her brow as Zayn approached. He didn't speak right away, he just stared at her, the tension thick between them. What was that? He finally asked, his tone cold. Mira crossed her arms. It was training. I didn't hurt her. You almost did, Zayn snapped. You're slipping, Mira. Mira's chest tightened. Maybe I wouldn't be if you actually stood by me instead of her. Zayn's eyes narrowed. Don't turn this on me. Mira held his gaze, refusing to back down. Zayn took a step closer, his wolf flickering behind his eyes. You're walking a thin line, Mira. If you can't control yourself, you're going to lose more than just your temper. Her heart sank. She knew exactly what he meant. Zayn didn't wait for a response. He walked away, leaving Mira standing alone in the middle of the empty field, her wolf still growling softly in the back of her mind. The pack house was packed for the monthly meeting. Wolves filled every inch of the main hall, leaning against walls or sitting on the long wooden benches. The air buzzed with quiet chatter, but Mira stood near the front, eyes fixed on Zayn. He sat at the head of the table, looking calm and in control. Sylvia sat just to his right, again. Her presence next to him was starting to feel permanent. Mira's wolf bristled. She scanned the room, noticing how some of the lower-ranked wolves shifted uncomfortably. They were watching, waiting, just like her. Zayn cleared his throat, silencing the room. "The patrol schedules will shift next week," he announced. "Sylvia will be handling the restructuring." Mira's jaw clenched. That was her role. She glanced around, catching the confused glances of a few wolves who had clearly noticed the shift. Mira took a step forward, her heart pounding but her expression calm. "Since when does Sylvia manage patrols?" Mira asked, her voice carrying through the hall. All eyes turned to her. Zayn's gaze sharpened. "Since I decided it was necessary." Mira crossed her arms. "Last I checked, that was my responsibility, as Luna." The room fell even quieter. Zayn didn't answer right away, and Mira could feel the weight of the pack's attention pressing down on both of them. She stepped closer, closing the gap between them. "If you're making changes that affect the pack," Mira said firmly, "the Luna should be involved. Or have you forgotten that?" A few wolves murmured slightly, nodding in agreement. Zayn's eyes narrowed slightly, but Mira didn't look away. She could feel the tension crackling between them. This wasn't just a disagreement, it was a test. Sylvia leaned in, her lips curving into that same smug smile. "I'm only helping where I'm needed, Mira. No need to take it personally." Mira's wolf growled low, but she kept her expression calm. "I wasn't talking to you." Sylvia's smile faded. Zayn's gaze flickered between them before finally settling on Mira. His wolf was stirring, restless beneath the surface, but Mira stood her ground. "Fine," Zayn said, after a long pause. "Mira will handle the patrol shifts." Mira's chin lifted slightly, victory sparking in her chest. The lower-ranked wolves nodded approvingly, clearly taking note of the exchange. Mira saw a few of them glance at each other, as if quietly choosing sides. Bending at the waist. But just as the tension started to ease, Zayn stood up. Without a word, he turned to Sylvia and kissed her. Right there, in front of everyone. The room fell silent, stunned. Mira's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to stay still. Zayn pulled away casually, as if the kiss had meant nothing. His eyes flicked to Mira, watching carefully, waiting for her reaction. Mira met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of breaking, not in front of the pack. Instead, she offered the faintest smile. "Enjoy the moment, Sylvia. It won't last." With that, Mira turned and walked out of the room, her wolf's steady growl echoing softly in her mind. Zayn wanted to test her? Let him. Chapter 9. Rising Tension. The forest surrounding the pack house felt different lately, tenser, like the trees themselves held their breath. Mira noticed it every time she walked along the border, and she wasn't the only one. "Another patrol spotted them this morning," Lucas said, falling into step beside her. His eyes scanned the tree line as they walked. Mira nodded, already knowing who them meant. Adrian's pack had been lingering just outside their territory for the past week. They never crossed the line, but they didn't hide either. "They're pushing Zayn," Mira muttered. Lucas chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, well, someone needs to." Mira shot him a look, but he didn't back down. "I'm just saying," Lucas shrugged. "Adrian's pack hasn't done anything wrong. Yet. But you can tell it's messing with Zayn. I mean, he doubled patrols last night." Mira couldn't argue. Zayn had been on edge ever since Adrian's pack started circling closer. "Do you think Adrian's testing him?" she asked quietly. Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but I think he's watching you too." Mira felt her wolf stir at that. Adrian's attention hadn't gone unnoticed. She caught him staring more than once during council calls, and every time their wolves crossed paths near the border, she felt something pull between them. Something hard to ignore. They reached the edge of the clearing, where two of Adrian's pack members stood on the opposite side of the border. Mira's eyes narrowed as she recognized one of them. Adrian's beta, Cade. Kay's gaze flicked over to her, and after a moment, he nodded in greeting. Mira gave a curt nod back, but Lucas crossed his arms, standing firm beside her. "They're not even trying to hide anymore," Lucas muttered. Before Mira could respond, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. Zayn emerged from the trees, his wolf close to the surface. He barely glanced at Mira, his eyes locked on the rival wolves across the border. "You shouldn't be here," Zayn growled, stepping in front of Mira. Cade smirked. "We're just patrolling. No law against that." "You're too close," Zayn snapped. The man studied Mira for a moment, then shrugged. Cade opened his mouth to respond, but Adrian's voice cut through the trees before he could. "They're right where they need to be." Adrian stepped out from the shadows, his dark eyes locking onto Zayn's with calm confidence. He was taller than Zayn by just a few inches, but the way he carried himself made the difference feel larger. Mira's wolf stirred the second Adrian's gaze flicked to her. Zayn growled low, placing himself more firmly between Mira and Adrian. "What do you want?" Adrian crossed his arms, leaning casually against a tree. "Relax, Zayn. I'm just keeping an eye on things. Can't be too careful these days." Zayn's eyes narrowed, but Adrian's gaze shifted back to Mira, lingering for just a little too long. "You know where to find me," Adrian said softly, his tone meant only for her. Mira's heart skipped. Her wolf didn't shy away from him. Instead, it pulled closer, brushing against his energy like it recognized something familiar. Adrian held her gaze for a second longer, before turning and disappearing into the woods. Cade followed, leaving Zayn glaring after them. Mira expected him to say something, but he didn't. He just stood there, fists clenched at his sides. As they walked back to the pack house, Mira's wolf stayed restless, the memory of Adrian's presence lingering in her chest. For the first time, Mira realized something she didn't want to admit. Her wolf wasn't longing for Zayn anymore. It was longing for Adrian. The pack house was quiet, shadows stretching long across the wooden floors. Most of the pack had gone to bed hours ago. But Mira found herself wide awake, staring at the ceiling of her room. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Pushing the blankets aside, she slipped out of bed and padded softly down the hall. The silence felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. As she passed Zayn's office, faint voices caught her attention. Mira paused, her hand hovering near the doorknob. Zayn's voice drifted through the crack, low and serious. She wouldn't have stopped, she wasn't the type to snoop. But then she heard her name. "Mira doesn't need to know." Mira's heart skipped. She pressed her back against the wall, holding her breath as she leaned closer to listen. "It's only a matter of time before the bond snaps." Sylvia's voice followed, smooth and confident. "She's weak now. The pack sees it. Some of them even agree she's not fit to lead." Mira's nails dug into her palm. Sylvia's voice dropped lower, but Mira heard every word. "We both know what needs to happen, Zay. I can challenge her. Pack law allows it." "As long as you approve." Mira's heart pounded in her chest. "Challenge me?" A wolf could challenge another for dominance, but no one had dared to challenge a Luna in years. It was rare. And dangerous. Zayn's silence hung thick in the air. "She's not dangerous," Zayn finally said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Sylvia laughed softly. "Isn't she? Look how she's been sneaking off, how often she's near the border. You really think the pack won't notice the way Adrian's been watching her? If you don't act first, someone else will. And when that happens, Sylvia paused for effect, she'll leave. Maybe not today, but she will. Mira's breath hitched. She wouldn't betray the pack, Zayn muttered, but even he sounded like he wasn't sure. She'll betray you? Sylvia pressed. Mira squeezed her eyes shut, anger burning in her chest. She wanted to walk in, to demand answers, but her wolf urged her to wait. Then the floor creaked under her foot. Mira froze. The conversation inside stopped instantly. Moments later, the office door eased open. Sylvia stepped out, her eyes locking with Mira's the second she spotted her. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Mira expected Sylvia to act surprised, maybe make an excuse, but instead, Sylvia's lips curved into the faintest smirk. She said nothing, simply tilting her head in mock amusement, like she had already won. Without a word, Sylvia slipped back inside and closed the door behind her. Mira stayed frozen in place, her heart hammering in her ears. Through the thin door, Zayn's voice carried softly, too low for her to make out the words. But she didn't need to hear them. She already knew what he was saying. Mira's wolf bristled, a low growl rumbling deep in her chest as Zayn's final murmur filled the space between them. He was agreeing. Chapter 10. The Ultimatum. The morning sun barely touched the edges of the forest as Mira slipped away from the pack house, careful to avoid the creaky floorboards. The weight in her chest hadn't lifted since overhearing Zayn and Sylvia the night before. Her wolf stirred anxiously beneath her skin, but the second she crossed the border, the tension started to fade. She could feel Adrian's presence nearby, calm, steady, like the cool wind that rustled through the trees. Mira found him waiting near the river, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed. His dark eyes lifted as soon as he sensed her approaching. "You're getting good at sneaking out," Adrian said, a playful edge to his voice. Mira gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I've had a lot of practice lately." Adrian's gaze narrowed slightly as he stepped away from the tree. He could see it, whatever she was carrying. "What happened?" he asked, his tone softer now. Mira hesitated, staring at the ground as she twisted a small twig between her fingers. The words stuck for a moment, but eventually she forced them out. "I heard them talking. Sylvia plans to challenge me for the Luna title," Mira admitted. "And Zayn? He's letting her." In mine just starting to snarl into fangs. Adrian's jaw tightened, his usual calm exterior wavered, and for the first time, Mira saw something else flicker behind his eyes. Anger. He stepped closer, resting his hand lightly on her arm. His touch was warm, grounding, and his wolf brushed against hers, protective and sure. "I knew she was ambitious, but I didn't think Zayn would sink this low," Adrian muttered. His eyes searched hers, and for a brief moment it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. Mira's heart thudded unevenly. Her wolf pushed forward, drawn to him in a way she couldn't ignore anymore. Adrian's hand lingered on her arm, his thumb brushing gently against her skin. "Mira," he said quietly, his voice rougher now. "You know I felt it too. The bond between us. Stronger every time we meet." Mira's breath caught. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I know you still feel tied to Zayn, but whatever's left of that bond, it's breaking." Mira met his gaze, but she didn't deny it. Adrienne exhaled, stepping even closer, so close their wolves practically touched. "If you stay, Sylvia's going to follow through with her challenge. And if Zayn doesn't stop her—" "I know," Mira whispered. Adrian's eyes softened, but there was urgency in his voice. "Come with me. Leave Blackthorn behind and join my pack. You don't have to fight this alone." Mira's wolf pulled toward him, the temptation stronger than it had ever been. She knew that with Adrian things could be different, easier. But leaving wasn't simple. Mira's fingers curled into the fabric of her jacket. I can't just walk away. Not yet. Adrian's eyes darkened slightly and his hand slid away, though his wolf still brushed against hers. You can't fight this forever, Mira, he said softly. Mira looked away, heart heavy with indecision. Later that evening, Mira lingered near the window in her bedroom, watching as the last of the sunlight faded over the trees. The door creaked open behind her, and she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Zayn's reflection appeared in the glass, his posture stiff, arms crossed. I know you've been sneaking out, he said coolly, his voice devoid of any warmth. Mira didn't flinch. You need to step down, Mira. Zayn's words cut through the quiet like a knife. She finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his head-on. It's over, he added, holding her gaze with that same cold distance she'd felt for weeks. Mira stood tall, her wolf stirring in quiet defiance. Maybe it is, she thought, but she wasn't going down without a fight. Mira's fingers curled into her palm, nails pressing lightly against her skin. She forced herself to keep her head down, eyes fixed on the floor as Zayn's words echoed in her mind. Step down. It's over. She didn't argue. Not this time. Okay, Mira whispered, her voice soft, almost fragile. She let her shoulders slump slightly, feeling Zayn's gaze pierce through her. Zayn's wolf stirred, watching her carefully. He was waiting for resistance, some sign that she would fight back. But she gave him nothing. Sylvia leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a satisfied smile tugging at her lips. Smart choice, she said lightly. Mira didn't look up. I'll take over your duties from here, Sylvia added, as if she hadn't already decided that long ago. Mira nodded. I understand. Zayn's tense posture relaxed slightly, and Mira felt his wolf retreat. He believed it. They both did. Let them. In the days that followed, Mira drifted quietly in the background. She stopped attending morning meetings and skipped patrol assignments. Sylvia slid into her place, sitting by Zayn's side during every gathering. The pack barely noticed the shift. Mira caught glimpses of their subtle loyalty shift, wolves lingering near Sylvia during training, seeking her out for advice. It didn't surprise her, saying the pack followed strength, and Mira's silence was starting to look like weakness. That was exactly what she wanted. Because while Sylvia soaked up the spotlight, Mira worked in the shadows. Late at night, she met with Ava, Lucas, and the few packmates who hadn't bought into Sylvia's charm. They gathered behind the training fields, away from curious eyes. Mira didn't hold back during those sessions. She pushed harder than she ever had, driving her wolf to its limits. The muscles in her arms ached, and her skin glistened with sweat under the moonlight. Lucas whistled low after one of their spars, rubbing his shoulder where Mira had pinned him. Remind me not to get on your bad side? Mira smiled faintly, stretching out her sore muscles. I'm not ready yet. You're close, Ava chimed in, wiping dirt from her hands. I've never seen you fight like this. Mira's wolf flickered beneath the surface, restless but patient. She wasn't ready to reveal her full strength, not until the right moment. As the others left, Mira lingered near the border, the cool air brushing against her skin. She felt him before she saw him. Adrien emerged from the trees, his sharp gaze locking onto hers as he approached. His presence was steady, grounding, and the tension she carried seemed to ease. You're late, Mira teased. Adrien smirked, stopping just a few feet away. You're the one who keeps calling me out here. You could just admit you like seeing me. Mira rolled her eyes, but her wolf hummed in quiet agreement. They didn't speak much after that. Instead, they sparred beneath the moon, their wolves brushing against each other with every movement. Mira felt it growing stronger, the pull between them. As they circled each other, Adrian shifted into his wolf. His sleek black fur shimmered under the pale light, and he nipped playfully at her side. Mira hesitated for only a second, before shifting as well, her white wolf pressing close to his. His warmth felt familiar, safe. Her wolf leaned into him, trusting, longing for more. And for the first time in weeks, Mira didn't pull away. The next afternoon, Mira stood at the training grounds, observing quietly as Sylvia led drills. Zayn was nearby, watching with his usual calm expression. Mira kept her distance, pretending to be disinterested. But Sylvia wasn't fooled. She strode over, her gaze sharp as she stopped in front of Mira. "You've been quiet," Sylvia said, eyes narrowing. "A little too quiet." Mira arched a brow. "You told me to step back. I'm doing exactly that." Sylvia's wolf stirred, sensing the tension that lingered just beneath Mira's calm exterior. "You can't fool me," Sylvia snapped, her voice low so only Mira could hear. "I know you're planning something." Mira smiled faintly. "Maybe you're just paranoid." Sylvia growled softly, her wolf pushing forward. Without warning, Sylvia lunged, her shift rippling through her instantly as she attacked in front of the pack. Mira's wolf bristled, but she didn't fully shift. Instead, she sidestepped the attack, catching Sylvia's shoulder and shoving her back with just enough force to make her stumble. Sylvia snarled, baring her teeth. Mira held her ground, heart pounding, her claws twitching beneath the surface. She could have ended the fight right there, but she didn't. Not yet. Zayn's voice cut through the tension, snapping everyone to attention. "That's enough." Sylvia straightened, glaring at Mira. But Mira met her gaze without fear. "Soon," she thought. "Soon."